Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto. Happy to be back in the U.S. Actually, I mentioned that I went to Geneva, New York to play disc jockey for a day. I've been working on that video all day long, but I had two cameras in the studio. 5 hour long shift gives me 10 hours of video to slice up. So that'll go up in a day or two. A highlight reel of me on the air as a disc jockey. But to get to Geneva, New York from Michigan, I drove through Canada. It's the first time I've been in Canada in a vehicle in a long time. Now you might say, Steve, why are you specifying in a vehicle? I mean, I know you're a lawyer and you speak very specifically sometimes, but is that a specification that's really necessary? And it actually is, because the last 4 or 5 times I've been in Canada, I went there on foot. And I've mentioned this before, and again, this is like a trick question, but I run the Free Press Marathon every year, which starts in Detroit. You run around for a couple miles in Michigan, then you run across the Ambassador Bridge, then you run around in Canada for a couple miles, then you run through the tunnel underneath the Detroit River back into Michigan for another 20 miles of pain. So it's an interesting experience because, among other things, you cross two international borders. You run a really, really big bridge, and then you go underneath a river. It's a mile underwater. They jokingly call it the underwater mile. So it's a fascinating experience. But of course, they don't have, people at the borders checking your ID as you cross. So what happens is when you enter the race, you sign a bunch of documents, you pay a lot of money, but then you go down to the expo the day before the race and you pick up your race bib, your race number, your tag, and that's got a magnetic strip on the back. It identifies you. And then before they give it to you, they're actually authorized to ask you to prove that you are a U.S. citizen who's allowed to travel out of the country and then back in again. I've got a very good friend who is in America on some sort of work visa and actually wanted to run the marathon, and he couldn't because he didn't have the proper authority to be leaving the country and coming back in for such frivolous purposes, I guess. So I actually go down to pick up my race packet, get my T-shirt, my race bib, and I've got to bring my passport with me and show it to them then, so I don't have to carry it when I run. Now they often do tell you ought to carry it when you run, but no one ever does. And there are people at the border watching to make sure you've got a race number visible. And so, you run in, there's people standing there, they watch you, but they let you run by. You run around and you run back into America. And as far as I know, no one's ever been stopped that I've heard of. So the last, like I said, 5 or 6 times I've been in Canada, I was on foot. So the other day, I drove to Geneva, New York by way of Port Huron and Sarnia, and then crossed over into New York near Buffalo and Niagara. And so it was interesting because it's been a while, and so you're in the long line of cars, you pay to go over the bridge, and then the other side is you're entering the countries where you always get the third degree. And it's kind of funny because both times the Canadians asked me to roll down the window behind me. I was driving my new Explorer, and the rear windows are kind of tinted. So I rolled the window down, but there's nobody back there. But the funny thing is that they always try to ask you a couple goofy questions. And so crossing into Canada, the woman goes, where are you going? I said, well, I'm actually driving to New York. I'm just passing through. And she said, oh, are you going to visit anybody in Canada? I said, no, I'm just passing through. And she goes, oh, okay. Where are you going? I said, I'm going to New York. And she goes, why? And I said, well, I'm going to be a disc jockey for a day. And she goes, oh, really? That's interesting. Are you going to visit anybody in Canada? No, she already asked me that. I said, no. She goes, oh, okay, have a nice day. And she hands me back the passport. So then, crossing over into America, similar, they ask me, where are you going? Do you have any weapons in the car? What are you going to be doing in New York, in Geneva? And I said, I'm going to be a disc jockey for a day. Really? That's interesting. What kind of music? I said, classic rock. And any weapons in the car? It's just funny because, they have I'm sure they've got a little cheat sheet down there. It says, ask one of the following questions, but just ask it twice. Just kind of mix it up a little bit. And so the funny thing is, and again, I did 4 crossings, so into Canada, into the U.S., then into Canada, into the U.S., and I've lost track now which ones were which. But everybody's actually pretty cool. But it's kind of funny because one guy actually said, what kind of music did you play? And I said classic rock, and he goes, how'd it go? And I said, it went well. And he goes, cool. And he hands me back my passport. So at least one fan of the classic rock at the border. But it's kind of funny. But, people always ask me, they say, Steve, what rights do you have crossing the border? Or what rights do they have to question you? And I got news for you. Okay, I'm an attorney. I'm licensed in Michigan. I'm here to tell you, crossing the border is one of the places where you've got the least, depends on how you want to quantify it, whether they're numerated or not. But you are in a lot of precariousness when you're crossing the border. Because number one, when you go into Canada, all bets are off. You're in Canada. Now, Canada is a great nation. I love the country dearly. They've got some wonderful things over there. I love their national anthem. It rocks. I like going to hockey games just to hear it. But the thing about it is that you're in Canada. You can't say, I've got rights. Well, you got whatever rights people have in Canada, but it's not the same as the rights you have over here. And of course, it's always a problem that when you're not a native of the land you are in, it's always a little precarious, So that's an issue when you go into Canada. You have to understand, I'm on my best behavior when I'm there. I'm just, I mean, they're so polite. Why not? But the point is, you may as well be, because of the fact that you don't want to run afoul of Canadian law. But of course, the other problem is that as you're entering into the U.S., coming back into the U.S., people say, but Steve, I am now on U.S. soil. I am a U.S. citizen. I've got rights, gall darn it. And I like to point out to people that the Supreme Court has ruled that because the security of our nation is so important, the people at the borders are allowed to be a little more intrusive of people crossing the border than, say, a police officer is in the middle of the country. Now, there's another story that's come out recently about how there's a 100-mile zone around the borders, and the ICE people are actually traveling in from the borders and sometimes doing some stuff. We'll get to that. That's another video altogether. But the point is that you, as an American citizen, when you're stopped at Border Patrol, okay, at the actual border by the Border Patrol and the immigration people, and they give you a hard time. I've seen it on the YouTube. I've seen the videos, the auditors who give those guys a hard time, and they're like, "No, I don't have to tell you what country I'm from. I'm an American beyond that. I've got rights." And they say, "Well, do you have any identification? Do you have anything to prove this?" "No, I'm an American. I've got rights." Well, just because you say you're an American doesn't prove you are an American. It would be really nice if you had a passport, if you could show it to them. I mean, it's been known for a couple of years that to cross the border, you should have some good identification, especially recently, a passport might come in handy. So the idea that you want to test your rights at the border is not the place you're going to be testing those. Because like I said, because of heightened security we've had, for a few years now, they have the right to be a little bit pickier about people crossing the border. So I've never had trouble at the border, not recently, not going way, way back, my entire life, but I've known people who have. I know a guy who went to Canada on a first or second date with somebody who they were driving down to Detroit, and this young lady said, "I've never been to Canada," just as a conversation starter, I think. And the man who was with her said, "Hey, let's go. It's so easy. We'll just drive across the bridge. We'll drive right back." And when they drove across the bridge, something happened, and somehow they got pulled out of the vehicle, and somehow somebody found marijuana in the young lady's purse. My friend told me, he said, "Steve, that date came to a screeching halt as you're both being strip searched in Canada," which, now, don't get me wrong. Some elements of that story might sound like an interesting night, but the phrase strip searched in Canada is not something most people want to be telling their friends about on a Monday morning at the office. So again, when you're crossing the border, be careful. Usually if you're polite and you're not acting really weird or suspicious, you'll just breeze right through. The real problem is the 50-car pileup before you get to the checkpoint. That's the problem. But again, that's a traffic issue. That's not really an ICE or a CBP problem. So that's the situation. Like I said, I just crossed the border a whole bunch of times going to New York, but I had a great time. Stay tuned. Shortly, I'll be posting a video of what it looks like when a disc jockey like me talks on the radio. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk together. Bye-bye.